Well, hello, my name is Johnny Rogers. I own and operate Rogers Cattle Company in Roxboro, North Carolina, and I'm also an extension associate in the Department of Animal Science with North Carolina State University, and I coordinate their amazing grazing program. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm going to talk about adaptive grazing management and how we can use managed grazing to improve pasture productivity. And I'm specifically going to talk about beef cattle production today, but a lot of things that I'll talk about improving pastures can work with any of our grazing species, all the way from cattle to horses. Just a little introduction to myself. As I mentioned before, my wife Sharon and I, we do own and operate Rogers Cattle Company. Around 2001, we started farming. We're kind of not really first generation farmers, but we did start up a farm, so in a lot of ways we are first generation because we are not farming our family's land. We found some land that we were able to lease, and we just started farming and raising cattle, and that's kind of what we wanted to do. And we are unique in that we do operate on 100% leased land, so we do not own an acre, but we have been very fortunate to find landlords that we can work with, and it's really been a good opportunity for us. I like to describe our operation as a limited equipment operation because we don't make any hay, we don't harvest any type of forage. We have all that custom done, or we buy the hay that we need. So we're predominantly a grazing operation, and that's by choice. That's what we want to do. We want to manage animals and grass and the soil, and that's what we prefer to do. You can see by our enterprise mix, we are cattle folks, I swear, but we are easily distracted by other things apparently, and I say that jokingly. There is actually all of these enterprises. Some of them we're continuing to do today. Some of them have an expiration date, and each one of those served a specific purpose for a specific part of the evolution, I guess, of our business. So that's kind of a little bit about what I do at Rogers Cattle Company. And I did want to go ahead and I put in this slide, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to make the point that, of course, I'm very biased, but beef cattle are very important to our nation, I guess, as far as our food supply goes. And I think sometimes beef cattle get a bad rap as far as from an environmental impact standpoint. And I just kind of wanted to point out that there is some good science-based information out there from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, as well as other sources. A lot of the land that we use for beef cattle production would not be suitable to grow crops because it's too wet, too steep, too rocky. So it can't be cultivated. Even a lot of the corn that we use to finish beef cattle, again, that's not a very high percentage. Only about 10% of the corn harvested in this country actually goes to finished cattle. So again, and cattle, we like to think of them as upcyclers because they utilize a resource base, forages, and turn that into a highly nutritious and very tasty protein source that we can use. And they also utilize a lot of byproduct feeds and things that would end up going into a landfill. So cattle are very good for our ecosystem and do a lot of very important things. And we'll talk about some of those today. And so again, I'm very pro grazing, very pro beef cattle. So you are getting a very biased opinion, but I do want you to think about that. And if you have some more questions, certainly do some research, or we can talk about it a little bit later. So as I start to think about, grazing animals out on the landscape, I think certainly when you start to think about that, you need to go to one of the experts in grazing. I like to call him one of the founding fathers of managed grazing. That's Jim Garish. And Jim says this is when you buy, or in my case, rent or lease an acre of land, you buy or lease 43,560 square feet of solar panel. And really, it kind of goes back to those saying it takes grass to grow more grass. So really what Jim's saying here is we're managing that leaf area because we know the leaves are what absorbs the sunlight. And through that miracle of photosynthesis, we can grow more plant tissue. And that's what we're kind of measuring. We're capturing sunlight, and we're trying to manage that system. I also like to add this to Jim's quote and say you also have that same area to collect water in the form of rainfall. And I think these two things are very important. And I think a lot of folks kind of miss this. But if you'll kind of focus on collecting sunlight and collecting rainfall and doing everything, all the right management techniques to get that part done, everything else will come a lot easier for you. And I always like to think of these two things here as opportunities. They are not guarantees, because I see people who have an acre of land and they do a fantastic job of collecting sunlight and collecting water. I also see folks that do a very poor job in the very same area. So that's just something we need to think about. It's not a guarantee, and we need to use good management to get that done. With my program with Amazing Grazing at NC State, we talk a lot about adaptive grazing, and I guess we should talk a little bit about what is adaptive grazing. And this is going to look very similar. If you know anything about managed grazing or management intensive grazing, you're going to say, well, this is just management intensive grazing. And it is to a very high degree. We like to think of it as using these common grazing principles that you would use in managed grazing, but you use it in a very flexible way as conditions change, as animal requirements change, as forage production changes, or as maybe your life changes. Maybe you get a different schedule, work schedule for your off the farm job, and you're not able to move cattle every day. You have to go to moving them maybe 2 times a week. So again, it has to be flexible, it has to be dynamic, because the environment that we operate in, all of those things are going to be very variable, and we have to adapt to that. So one of the things that you really need to keep in mind as you look at a plant, a forage producing plant, or really any plant, is that it's kind of a mirror image. So what you have above the ground is going to be mirrored below the ground in terms of root growth. And this is a kind of an interesting study. And what they're doing here is they're cutting this forage to a 2-inch height at different frequencies. So we're really having the same intensity of grazing, if you will, going down to 2-inch grazing height, maybe starting at 8 inches, going down to 2, but you're doing it every week versus every 4 week. So we're really trying to manage that recovery period with our forages, if you will. And when the forages have more time to recover, they can grow more leaf area back, capture more sunlight, and that'll allow us to pump more energy into the plant, which allows for greater root growth. Now think about this: which kind of plant is going to be more productive if you have limited rainfall in a given year? Obviously, the plant that has more root growth can reach down further into the soil, bring up more nutrients, and scavenge for more moisture. So again, that's what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to try to manage the intensity of our grazing as well as the frequency of our grazing. So there's a lot of tools that we can use to accomplish adaptive grazing. And, we try to promote using a lot of temporary fence, a lot of polywire, and all this, of course, is electrified. Sometimes then the limiting factor becomes water availability, and we can't get water where we need to, even though we have temporary fence. So we use, try to use a permanent water strategically where we can. And sometimes we even use some just temporary black pipe on top of the ground to get water where we need it to manage our grazing system. And of course, sometimes you need something to haul all those supplies around. So an ATV or UTV comes in pretty handy. Probably the biggest tool and the key tool to have is an open mind about all this. I think too often we are hindered by tradition and doing things the way we always done them, and we don't explore new innovative techniques that could help us be more productive. I had the privilege during my time at NC State here over the last 5 years to work with a conservation innovation grant project. And we looked at improving soil health in pasture-based livestock systems in the Southeast. And some of the key things we wanted to look at is improving grazing management and nutrient distribution, soil health assessment for pasture systems, looking at mixed species cover crops in perennial systems and how they would kind of fit, and also create a learning environment for producers and support agencies like USDA, NRCS, Soil and Water Extension, that would allow them to help work with producers to develop innovative grazing plans. And I'll share with you just some of the really interesting things that we kind of pulled together out of this project. This is at the Butner Beef Cattle Field Lab, one of the research stations at NC State. And you can kind of see here these darker areas in the top right-hand part of the screen. These are winter feeding areas. And you can see that kind of dark area, and you can even make out some of the hay, leftover hay residue. So this would be a typical hay ring, concentrated type feeding area. I would like to point out that the best management practices are being used here, that a lot of these water areas and drainage ways are fenced off. So we have taken care of the environment and using good management practices there. You have vegetative strips, kind of filtering out any runoff that might happen. And of course, yes, these feeding areas are convenient to the gate and they're convenient to the two barns there on the right hand of the screen where the hay is stored. So there's a lot of convenience goes into this decision about where to feed hay, but there's also some environmental considerations as well. These dots you see here, those are a 30-meter grid of where we took soil samples and composited them, and we looked at soil health characteristics, and we also looked at just traditional soil testing through the North Carolina Department of Agriculture labs. Again, that's just kind of pointing out those feeding areas. And then you end up with a map like this. And this is just for one nutrient that might be of interest for us agronomically, and this would be phosphorus. And you see a kind of an interesting pattern taking shape here, isn't it? And it kind of goes back to what we've always known. About 85 to 90% of what goes in a cow's mouth actually comes out the back end, in the form of fecal material, and some nutrients come out as urine as well. So you can see cattle kind of congregate in an area, and of course, some of that hay that we're feeding, it all has nutrients in it, and some of it cycles through the cattle. Some of it will actually be wasted and not consumed by the cattle, kind of leftover residue, but it stays there, especially with a nutrient like phosphorus. Now, we know other nutrients might be a little more mobile in the soil profile, but with phosphorus, we know as long as the soil's there, it's going to be there. So again, this kind of makes you pause and think about, okay, what are we doing here? And to me, I see an opportunity. I see parts of this field that has a very low phosphorus level, down here getting closer to this a large lake that we have down here. And then, of course, you see areas where we're feeding that have very high levels of phosphorus. So I see a great opportunity here of a more dispersed method of feeding that might help us actually grow more forage because we're able to more closely meet the needs for phosphorus for our forages. So down in these areas, the plants would respond to additional phosphorus. We're getting a lot of phosphorus accumulated up in these other areas. We kind of went back and looked at this at one of our other research stations, and this is the Cherry Research Farm down in eastern North Carolina. So you can kind of see just the layout of the farm. And then when you go in and look at a nutrient like phosphorus, you see a very similar pattern, because in these blue areas, this would indicate higher levels of phosphorus. Well, guess what? Those are the winter feeding areas, or typically winter feeding areas for this particular farm. So you see that kind of interesting pattern taking shape. Now, what about a nutrient like nitrogen? Well, again, you kind of see the same pattern kind of coming into play here, but it's not quite as intense. And why would that be? Well, because we know that nitrogen is much more volatile in the soil. It can be leached out, down through the soil profile. You also lose some to volatilization. And one of the other key things that we looked at is soil biological activity. And this is measured by CO2 burst. This might be, some of you might have heard of the Solvita test or the Haney test. So you're basically looking at carbon dioxide release after a period of drying the soil and re-wetting it. Well, again, you see this same elevated level of biological activity where we've had those winter feeding areas. So to me, that's saying that, hey, there's some good thing about, adding these nutrients and adding carbon in the form of hay in these areas. But again, there can also be a buildup there of other nutrients. So again, how do we manage that system? And I think those are some things that we have to think about going forward. So one of the things we started encouraging producers to do is, like in the bottom left-hand portion of the screen here, we encourage them to utilize stockpile forage and then use strip grazing in an adaptive management fashion to ration that hay out over 1 to 3 days. And that replaces a lot of the hay that they would need to feed during the wintertime. You're moving away from that concentrated hay feeding system by using strip grazing. Up here in the top right-hand portion of the screen, we're encouraging producers, instead of using the traditional, let's feed all of our hay in hay rings in one site on our farm, let's use a more dispersed feeding of hay, because again, we know where we unroll that hay, we're going to add carbon in the form of the organic matter that's not consumed. And we also know that where the cattle eat, they're also going to urinate and defecate. And again, a lot of those nutrients can be added to our soil. If we unroll that hay on some of the poorer areas of our land, we can help increase the productivity. I like to think of it this way. For every dollar that cattle consume that goes into their mouth, about 85% of it, 85 cents worth, is going to be deposited somewhere on your farm. Where they deposit that is critical. Let's deposit that 85 cents somewhere where it'll help us grow more grass in the future. Mike and Gene Jones over in the foothills of North Carolina do a very good job of this, of utilizing some temporary fence and unrolling hay, and then look at the beautiful forage. This would be the same area of the field later the next spring. So again, making a really good impact just with a few simple management techniques. Another thing that we talk about in Amazing Grazing a lot is the power of one wire. And I need to explain that a little bit. And what does that mean? Well, here's a typical field that you might have. And again, this blue outline kind of shows you the field boundaries. You've got some shade, you've got some water source. This blue dot down here at the bottom of the screen would be your water source. And what we propose that producers do to get started with adaptive grazing management is come in here with a semi-permanent fence post. This would be a fiberglass temporary fence post, showed one on the previous slide, and then just run you a temporary fence over there with some step-in posts and poly wire. And then you just would tie this into your electric perimeter fence. Hopefully you do have an electric perimeter. If not, there's certainly some ways to manage around that. And then you go up here and you turn your cows in. You can see the cow coming in and she's grazing and doing everything that cows do, consuming the forage. And then once you get down your grazing to the proper height, you can go in and come over here and you can roll up your temporary fence, and the cows, they learn pretty quick that they can just go right through there, and then you can move your temporary fence over to the other side. So now cattle have water, they have shade. You probably brought a salt and mineral mix over here. You moved your portable feeder. So now they're grazing over here, and this side over here is resting. And again, we talked about that rest period, how critical that is for forage growth and root development. And what did we do here? When we did this, just this simple thing, cutting this pasture roughly in half, we doubled our stock density. And we know from managed grazing that improving stock density is a good thing. We increased our rest period of our forages. We know that forages need rest, time to recover, takes grass to grow more grass. The other thing that you did here is your cattle learned about temporary electric fence in a very non-threatening way. They probably went up and checked it out, kind of smelled of it, got popped on the nose and said, okay, I don't need to mess with that anymore. The other thing is you learned how to use temporary electric fence, and that can be very important. The reason this power of one wire is so powerful, I think, is because it ties in to everything else that we do in our farming systems. I hear a lot of people talk about, well, I'm going to go out and find my cows. They're out in the pasture somewhere. When you start utilizing this power of one wire and temporary electric fence, your cattle will find you. When you come up, they'll start walking to you, and I'm actually on the other end of this poly wire reeling it up, and here come the cows by me. And I can watch those cows. I can get a good head count. I can evaluate body condition score and gut feel. I can look for problems with feet and legs and udders. In the summertime, I can do a fly count and see if my fly control is doing a good job. I can see the ones that are slow, the ones that aren't moving very fast. Is there something wrong with them? Are they in bad health, or do they just not fit my environment? If there's calves there, I can look for scours, dehydration, a lot of different things. And I tell you, in North Carolina, we have beef quality assurance, and I'm sure y'all do in Pennsylvania as well. Everything I just described really fits into just good management practices for beef cattle producers. Now, we talked a lot about temporary fence, and obviously not everyone's using a lot of temporary fence today, and we promote that a lot with Amazing Grazing. We have a lot of workshops where we show people how to use it, how to get familiar with it. We have producers like Mike Jones up here in the top left-hand corner of the screen, and we have producers helping other producers learn. So this is one of our famous Amazing Grazing workshops, and we're known for getting out onto the land, getting tools, grazing management tools in the hands of producers and showing them how to do that. And we really like to establish this producer to producer communication and education. And again, Dr. Matt Poore there is on the right-hand side of the screen. He and I work very closely with this program, and he and I always talk about that our best workshops sometimes are the ones where we kind of get off topic and we talk about what the producers want to talk about and what's on their mind and the challenges they're having. And again, sometimes you don't know the answer. Sometimes we develop the answer kind of on site as we go. I think these educational opportunities out on the land is so important that we get that done and get it accomplished. So let's kind of wrap some things up that we talked about today. I hope by now you've kind of figured out that soil is the foundation of our farms, and it will respond to good management, good adaptive grazing management. So that's the exciting thing, is we can improve our soils no matter what a stage they're in today. We can make them better. Improving pasture soil health by increasing soil organic matter, adding carbon. And we can do that through grazing management, through stock density. We might do it through the strategies that we use to feed our hay. Healthy soils will increase water infiltration. So again, we've got that 43,560 square feet to collect sunlight and rainfall. And it's not how much rain falls on your pasture, it's how much you actually keep and actually goes into your soil. Grazing management is the key to improving pasture soil health, and it can be as simple as starting with the power of one wire. Split your pasture in half at the water source, graze half the field, graze the other half, then move to the next pasture, do the same thing. Pasture-based livestock systems, including beef cattle production, all of those, if we use good, sound grazing management principles, provide a tremendous economic and ecological benefit, not just to our farms, not just our communities, but really the whole society and our world. And these management grazing principles are very important, and we think they're the key to a lot of the challenges that we see out in our society today. We can make a very positive impact with good pasture management. So with that, I appreciate your time, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Thank you.